Hi, everyone. My name is Albert Świdziński. Welcome to another Strategy and Future podcast. With me today is my colleague, Ridvan Bari Urcosta, similar to Jacek Bartoszek, but not the same guy. And our guest today is Sam Bendett. Sam is with the American think tank CNA. He is an advisor at the CNA for the Strategy, Policy, Plans, and Programs Center, as well as a member of the Russia Studies program. We personally know Sam the best, I would imagine, in Strategy and Future due to his significant experience and authority on drones. But I think in this conversation, we'll be able to divert into more strategic topics as well. So Sam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Gentlemen, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay, Sam, let's dig right into it. So I would like to begin with a general question, because it is my idea, or like my feeling, that much of the perception of how the war in Ukraine is unfolding so far is shaped by the information war efforts, by the way the perception, by active shaping of perception of the conflict. So I wanted to ask you, what is your assessment of the current state of affairs across the numerous battlefields in Ukraine, and maybe especially focus on the application of unmanned systems, both aerial but also land-based systems or submersibles or surface unmanned systems? Is the perception we get of major triumph of Ukraine, TB2s destroying targets left and right, Russian Orlans flying with Canon cameras, is that what's really happening? How does it look?
Well, let's take this apart. So let's talk about the overall picture. So the overall picture is that the Russian forces have been apparently retreating from the Kharkiv region. They've been pushed out of Kiev region, and there's a significant consolidation and attempts to consolidate the territory in the east of the country as well as in the south of the country. So all war maps that show Russian presence in Ukraine today and Russian combat capabilities in Ukraine, they kind of show this solid area that stretches from Donbass all the way into the area north of the Crimea. So this is what the Russian military has been able to consolidate. This is where a lot of combat is now taking place. That is not a foregone conclusion in the sense that Russian forces may not be able to keep their gains in the east and the south as well. The Ukrainian military has proven extremely resilient, very capable, very able to counter Russian advances. And of course, a lot of that is done with the help of the new technology, such as drones and UAVs. And so a lot of fighting will now take place in the east of the country. It will take place in the south of the country, as the Ukrainian military would be attempting to regroup and try to push the Russian forces further eastward and further south, assuming that the significant military aid package from the United States and NATO starts arriving and will replenish Ukrainian military stockpiles. Of course, this has been a war that unfolded on social media as much as it did on the ground. And of course, for observers like ourselves, who are not there in Ukraine, who are not in Russia, who are not in Poland and other surrounding regions, we get to see what happens from social media. And social media, by definition, is information environment in and of itself. And of course, a lot has been said early on by many experts, by many pundits, in many reports and findings, that social media skews towards specific viewers. And so it isn't clear whether 100% of the overall picture could be acquired from viewing social media. We can certainly get a lot of data, and we can certainly get a lot of accurate data from social media. We can piece together a lot what's happening on the ground. But again, we depend on who is posting on social media and why. And so Ukrainian volunteers, Ukrainian military, Ukrainian social media bloggers and activists have been very active, as were the Russians as well. On Twitter, on Telegram, on other platforms, there's plenty of data that's available. But again, that type of content depends on who is posting. And so while we can get a fairly accurate picture, maybe up to 75 or 80% of the time, we are not really going to get 100% of what is happening from the social media environment. And this kind of takes us to the next part of this conversation and to the next part of your question, which was is the role of unmanned aerial systems, aerial drones in this war. And we've seen how both military and commercial technologies can not only coexist in a conflict like that, but they can reinforce and augment each other. And of course, there are two big winners in this war, in the sense, when it comes to unmanned aerial systems, and that's the Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drone, which has been used very successfully by the Ukrainian military, which apparently refuses to die, no matter how many times Russian MOD says that they've shut down most, if not all, of the Ukrainian drones, including most of the Bayraktars. They're still able to conduct spectacular assaults and attacks on the Russian military. And of course, once those videos are posted on social media, they get multiplied exponentially. And so while the overall strike may be of limited nature when it comes to some Russian military forces suffering attacks from Bayraktars, on social media, the impression is that Bayraktar is everywhere, it is ubiquitous, and the Russian military cannot hide from that UAV. And of course, the real situation is somewhere in the middle. And the other winner, if you will, from this real war, information war, and technological war are the commercial drones in general. Because we've seen commercial drones used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, for target acquisition, for general intelligence gathering. These are usually small Chinese-made DJI models as well as other models. They have a relatively short range. They have a relatively short operational ceiling, if you will. They can't fly very high. They cannot fly very fast. They're not supposed to. But in the war in Ukraine, a lot of military forces, both Ukrainian and Russians, have used these drones at that very tactical edge. And so we've seen videos of Russian allied forces from Donetsk and Lugansk republics. We've seen commercial drones used by Chechen and Rosbaria forces. We've seen commercial drones used by the official Russian military. And of course, we've seen these commercial drones used by the Ukrainian volunteers as well as the Ukrainian military as well. And so questions we have to ask, looking at this overall picture in the use of commercial UAVs, is whether, for example, for the Russians, as I mentioned before in other discussions, this was a breakdown in operational security, and the forces on the ground just decided to use something that wasn't readily available. Or if the Russian military tacitly approved the use of commercial drones because they didn't have enough of their own UAVs to operate in such a large country as Ukraine, or whether this was officially approved by the Russian military, as long as essentially the ends justify the means. And of course, for the Ukrainians, as we have seen before, as we have read before, commercial drones became very significant mission multipliers. They were acquired in large numbers for the defense of Kiev and Kharkiv, for mass-scale urban warfare that thankfully did not materialize in those cities. And now they're used extensively by multiple units providing intelligence and surveillance to the military. And so we kind of see this interesting organic meshing, organic coexistence of both military and civilian technologies, the sort of ad hoc, organic, and other types of concepts that are now used, again, by the professional military, by the actual military, as well as by the volunteers.
Samuel? Please.
Go ahead, Ridvan.
Just like a follow-up question, because I feel, but for instance, DARPA Corporation for years developing concept mosaic warfare, yes? And can we say that in Ukraine, exactly in this war, we are witnessing some kind of symbiosis of satellites, drones? Of course, we could divide or separate different categories, like, I don't know, strategic drones or tactical drones, and finally, artillery fire or tactical group. So it is like a pure symbiosis, what was developed in theory, but now we are witnessing it in practice, actually. What do you think?
Right. Right. And so for the Russian military especially, and I will concentrate a little bit more on the Russian military because that's what I study more. In this region, the Russian military was defining this concept as the reconnaissance strike, reconnaissance fire contours. that is aerial assets such as UAVs, providing intelligence and data acquisition on targets on the ground back to the Russian military forces, which then fielded long-range artillery, multiple launch rocket systems of different types, as well as manned aviation helicopters to strike those targets. And this was apparently tested out in Syria. And of course, now we can see the difference between Russian claims that they've incorporated lessons learned from Syria in their current combat, simply because, Ukraine is not Syria. Syria was much more permissive environment. The anti-Assad forces that the Russians were targeting did not have sophisticated air defenses, did not have sophisticated electronic warfare defenses. They couldn't resist the way Ukrainian military does. And so in Syria, Russian military was able to exercise this reconnaissance fire contour, use it in practice, fly different types of UAVs, ranging anywhere from 10 to 100 kilometers, and essentially then drill and practice that concept back in Russia in domestic drills and exercises. So once Russia invaded Ukraine, it encountered a military force that was significantly different from the one they expected and from the one they fought in Syria proper. And because Ukrainian military has adequate air defenses, radars, electronic warfare, special forces, because it uses those forces in combination with long-range artillery, it is the Ukrainians that are also very successful in utilizing this sort of concept of reconnaissance fire and reconnaissance strike contours. And we've seen Ukrainian military use both military and commercial UAVs for that. There are plenty of videos on social media with Ukrainian commercial UAVs essentially spotlighting a Russian military column, which is then struck by Ukrainian artillery anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes after that. And so both sides are using this concept. Again, it's not new, but it is logical. It is logical to use unmanned assets to identify your adversary in order to hit that adversary, because Russian military claimed for years that they're developing military autonomy in order to safeguard lives and make missions more effective. And of course, when they say safeguard lives, they're actually talking about safeguarding soldiers' lives, so that the soldiers are not at the tactical edge performing dangerous tasks in intelligence and surveillance, tasks that were recently or not that long ago conducted by helicopters and aircraft, and again, put pilots and equipment in danger. I do want to go back a little bit to our to the first question, because I think you're asking me whether Russian military fielded or anybody fielded unmanned ground vehicles or unmanned surface vessels for this war. Only Russians so far have fielded unmanned ground vehicles, and they fielded Uran-6 demining UGV. The UGV stands for unmanned ground vehicle. And that was done in a relatively controlled environment, meaning after the Russian forces and their allies cleared out a certain area, they rolled out the Uran-9 to look for mines, unexploded ordnance, and the videos we've seen didn't really feature any combat taking place around that situation. And I think in many ways, this was also the concept in Syria, that the Russian military used different types of UGVs once the Russian forces and Syrian forces cleared out a certain area, and then the Russian operators could operate in relative safety, because those videos show the Russian Uran-6 operator in relative proximity, very close proximity to the actual vehicle. And so if this was real combat, this would put the operator in danger. When it comes to Russian earlier claims that they have multiple projects dealing with unmanned surface and underwater vehicles in the works, well, they do have those projects. They're working on them, but they weren't fielded in Ukraine. We haven't seen evidence of that either from Russian or Ukrainian sources. What's interesting to watch here is that the American military aid package actually includes unmanned surface vessels for surveillance and reconnaissance. And there's now some speculation whether or not that would be an actual USV unmanned surface vehicle that was tested recently by the US Navy and that is actually in US Navy employment. And so that would be an interesting chapter to watch, the introduction of unmanned surface vessels in the maritime environment to look for the adversaries, to identify the adversaries, to scout certain areas for mines, for divers, for example, and essentially to be another set of eyes and sensors, or I should say another set of sensors in the maritime environment. We've seen the Ukrainian military take TB2 Bayraktar drones into the maritime environment, and they've been successful in striking select targets. There were also rumors early on that the TB2 was actually involved in the sinking of the Moskva. I think those rumors were debunked, but it shows the resilience and it shows the flexibility of these aerial platforms to be used not just over land, but also over sea, assuming that communication can be assured and protected between the UAV and the operators. And so it will be interesting to watch if the Ukrainian military fields American-supplied USVs, whether Russian military would also try to field their own unmanned maritime systems, at least for demining, at least for protection of the port facilities, the way they claim they tested them in years past.
If I could touch upon what you said about the versatility of unmanned systems, including, it's very interesting what you said about the theory of Moscow being, or of Moskva rather, being partially like TB2 being involved in targeting. So it's interesting, that it was debunked. But I also wanted to ask you, because again, as you pointed out, Russian MOD has claimed numerous times that they have basically destroyed the entire fleet of TB2s or of Bayraktar, and whether it's that they destroyed what Ukraine originally had and then Turkey resupplied, or whether it's just Russians being sort of lax with their standards of truthfulness. I wanted to ask you because it's interesting, because even though Bayraktar scored a lot of kills, and that's also a bit different to Russia and Ukraine war, because in Armenia-Azerbaijan war, they really killed many tanks, and I think they haven't killed quite as many in Ukraine. But the idea was that it was only possible for the Azeris to score so many kills because the environment was permissive. And it seems that their environment will be far less permissive this time around, and yet the drones appear to be quite successful. So the question is that assumption correct, or this assessment correct? And second of all, will that make militaries less risk averse when it comes to utilizing drones?
So I think I'll answer the last part first. I think militaries are very gung-ho on using military drones right now. I think previous conflicts, especially the Ukrainian conflict now, has proven the utility of the drone in general. It's proven the utility of very tactical UAVs, commercial type UAVs. It proved the utility of military-grade UAVs that can conduct persistent surveillance and reconnaissance. It proved the utility of combat drones like the Bayraktar, which are relatively inexpensive when compared to their competitors. And so especially the Bayraktar is now one of the most sought after military technologies by multiple militaries that can't afford manned aircraft, that can't afford expensive air forces, but can afford a fleet of Bayraktars, as well as multiple other UAV types like loitering munitions used in this war, used in the Nagorno-Karabakh war at scale, as well as other UAVs. I think there's no turning back right now when it comes to the utilization of unmanned aerial systems in general. I think previous conflicts and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, as well as other conflicts where UASs are involved, like the war in Yemen, for example, the continued war in Syria, the continued civil war in Libya, and other conflicts that break out occasionally, like the conflict in Ethiopia, where UAVs were also used. It has proven over and over again the utility of the UAVs as persistent sensor platforms and persistent combat platforms that could be launched and can stay in the air for hours. Their loss apparently is not that big of a deal for the militaries because they're relatively inexpensive when compared to acquiring even cheap aircraft. And so that sort of utility is there. There's additional sales of Bayraktar drones to other countries and so on and so forth. But I think overall, I think the first part of your question deals with the utility of new technologies in conflict, right? Am I getting that right? If you can let me know, sorry, Ed, if you can let me know the first part of your question, I'll try to answer that too.
Sure. Well, I was referring the second one was the drones. The first one was more concerned with the what was it? Jesus Christ! I was already like ahead of the question.
I can
You got it?
I can add to the question.
Go ahead.
Actually, within this framework, Bayraktars and the effective tactical drones, it was discussion right after the Nagorno-Karabakh war that Russia is possessing effective and actually war in Idlib region, because when in this area were quite successfully used Bayraktars. So, and the Russian experts, they said that Russia is possessing quite successful developed jamming system, anti-drone systems. Like,
That's
what
right.
do you
Okay.
yes, what do you think about this? And what if Ukraine is massively using Bayraktars against Russia, but at the same time, it is not visible that Russia is successful? Yes.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I do remember the first part of the question. I do apologize if I went off on a tangent. So I think you asked me whether the claims of downed UAVs or claims of UAV shot down are actually true, and whether or not Russian military can operate more or less successfully the way it planned in Ukraine. So what's interesting is that you actually mentioned earlier that social media is part of the information environment. Well, official statements are also part of the information environment as well. If we look at the number of military systems and vehicles that each side claims were shut down, right? We get a very different picture, because each military tries to sort of inflate the losses of their adversaries and minimize their own official losses. And so, like, the Russian military says that at this point in the war, over 600 Ukrainian UAVs were shut down, and that the Russian military shut down over 30 or so Bayraktars. And of course, Ukrainian military also says that anywhere between 200 and 400 Russian UAVs were shut down at different stages of this conflict. Social media evidence probably paints somewhat of a different picture. We are tallying how many Russian UAVs were lost to Ukrainian defenses. The numbers are less than 100, at least as shown on social media. But maybe we're not counting the quadricopters and multi-rotors that everybody uses, right? We have very little evidence, actually, surprisingly so, coming from the Russians about the Ukrainian UAVs they shut down. They like to show the wreckage of Bayraktar. They show occasional wreckage of the Leleka drone. But if they're saying that 600 UAVs were lost, we're not necessarily seeing lots of social media images and videos of these drones in the Russian hands, or at least over Russian territory. And so, again, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Each side is losing UAVs. We know Russians are certainly using UAVs. And a lot of these UAVs are probably commercial drones, which accounts for the large numbers in official statements about UAVs lost. But the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And prior to the war, Russian military claimed that the Bayraktars are not really going to be a danger, because Bayraktar is a relatively slow-flying, low-flying, almost World War I style aircraft, as was described by somebody. And so Russian advanced radar systems, advanced air defense systems, advanced electronic warfare systems would be able to light up this UAV and shoot it long before it got within effective range. What we've seen right now, what we've seen in Ukraine, is that that's not always the case. That doesn't happen 100% of the time. And if Russia has advanced layered defense, the echelon defense, as they called it in Syria, right? EW radars and air defenses working together, then it isn't ubiquitous, it isn't present everywhere. Ukraine is a very large country. Ukrainian front is a very long front. This is probably the largest scale combat taking place in that region since World War II. And so Russian military cannot provide a 100% coverage of their assets and soldiers everywhere. And so it is logical to assume that such layered defense is present in some areas, over some sites, over some assets, over some command and control areas, maybe some equipment, but it isn't present everywhere, and it cannot be present everywhere. And the evidence of that absence of this active air defense, active electronic warfare defense, active echelon defense are multiple videos of Ukrainian commercial drones getting practically on top of a Russian vehicle and dropping a bomb, the way we've seen those concepts used in Syria or in Libya, for example. And so we know that the Russian air defenses, their electronic warfare defenses, aren't present everywhere, right? And this is a topic of further discussion. I think it will, this will be kind of mulled over by the experts, whether this was sort of the lack of mass scale air defense that the Russians claimed they would have in the large war, whether this was an actual operational breakdown in this defense. And there were larger issues present here that enabled Ukrainian quadricopter civilian technology to get right on top of the Russian military forces. Russian military claimed that in Syria they actually practiced counter-UAS tactics with small arms fire, with counter-UAS rifles and electronic warfare systems which are mobile. We're not seeing that everywhere. And maybe that is actually used in places where Ukrainian quadricopters cannot penetrate or where they're actually shut down, right? Because again, in the social media environment, in an information warfare environment that we find ourselves today, the posts are relatively selective, and the posts on social media, on Twitter, on Telegram, are meant to exaggerate your own capabilities and diminish the adversarial capabilities. So I think that's kind of a long answer, but what's interesting is that the war in Ukraine is really debunking a lot of the Russian claims about full coverage and full protection against adversarial UAVs, especially the likes of the Bayraktar.
Yeah. If I could like continue along this track. So it seems that, you know, those whatever jamming assets or whatever counter UAV assets they might have, they are probably, you know, it's easier to employ those in a static environment, right? So
yes,
you know,
or a controlled environment, or relatively controlled environment.
Yep. So that means when you have like a maneuver warfare or dynamic battlefield with, you know, units moving across certain distances without, you know, being covered or, you know, coverage coming along with them, then the drones can really shine, right? When it's a dynamic battlefield with small engagements across, you know, major terrain or large battlefield, right? It's
right. When it comes to Russian dynamic environment, I think you brought up a very interesting point. Prior to the outbreak of this war, Russian military claimed that all of their actions are defensive, that they practice defensive warfare. The Zapad 2021 exercise last year was a defensive large-scale exercise. In other words, the Russian military was perfecting the war against a high-tech adversary like NATO, where they could be on the defensive, on their own territory, and have certain advantages that are not present to a force that is invading. This war in Ukraine is Russia on the offensive. Russia is the invading force. It is invading a country where a very patriotic population is willing to fight everywhere at once. It is invading a country and conducting large-scale offensive operations that it probably didn't adequately prepare for, right? If you're just preparing for defensive ops, conducting offensive operations is a different matter. And we've seen breakdown in logistics, breakdown in communication, breakdowns in operational security, with Russian soldiers using commercial technologies like cell phones, where they could be easily identified. We've seen other commercial technologies like DJI drones used, again, at the very tactical edge. And so this is a different type of war. And conducting offensive operations requires very different preparations and training. Preparations and training that was probably absent in some of the Russian units that crossed the border into the Ukraine. That's not to say that the Russian military did not train for offensive operations. It certainly did. But most of their claims, most of their ops, most of their concepts revolved around defending the country, defending their units against a high-tech adversarial force. Now that they're actually involved in offensive operations, they're probably seeing the concepts that they trained for exercised by the Ukrainians themselves. The defensive operations, the dispersed operations, the maneuver operations, the special forces type operations, the urban warfare operations are all, they're all exercised by the Ukrainians to a very significant extent. And Russian military, as unprepared as it was in the first several weeks of the war, conducting offensive operations was a completely different matter for the MOD, for the Russian MOD to consider and maintain. And now they have to sort of deal with the consequences of the first weeks of that offensive operation that certainly did not go as planned.
It's super interesting what you said with the, again, defending force in a dispersed environment, and being able to operate across large terrain in small units, really being able to reap benefits of the drone, of the presence of drones. And that's actually so many questions. I'm sorry, Ridvan, for being like a hoarder here.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
So look, infantry tactics or small unit tactics, and we've seen that the battlefield is really saturated with DJIs, with other quadcopters. So it clearly, I got my answer in a way that it promotes defense, right? In that sense. But
well, it promotes limited offensive operations because, for
Sure.
example, drones like DJIs have a very short range, and so you can sort of see around the corner, see just above the horizon where the adversarial forces are. But you can't see very far because those drones cannot fly very far. So DJIs are used for close range fighting and for relatively close range combat. If DJIs or other civilian drones are able to fly at longer distances, then they can light up Russian columns, Russian artillery, Russian tanks and armored vehicles at a significant distance from drone operators. And we've seen that before. But for most part, these are very tactical UAVs as designed. They're designed as commercial sort of entities, right? They're commercial drones where you can just fly so far and so high. But that in itself could be very useful because even flying at short ranges, again, even just looking around the corner, you can just send a UAV to do that job instead of sending a soldier or a team of soldiers who can be killed. And the Russian military recently posted a video of their forces fighting in Mariupol with I think 1 or 2 soldiers actually getting killed in the process. And they were explaining that, well, it was necessary to post the video to show the difficulty of these type of operations and the sacrifices made by the soldiers. Well, once again, even the Russian forces themselves, the Donetsk forces recently posted a video where they claim that they are using DJI drones to look around the corner and essentially see what's going on at a short distance away instead of sending a soldier who can then be killed.
Yes, actually, about these small drones, because we heard a lot of speculations that actually it's close cooperation between China and Russia regarding the drones, particularly small drones. Have you heard about this something?
Yes, there have been many claims from the Ukrainian defenders, from the Ukrainian users of DJI that their operations are hampered by DJI, that the coordinates of their DJI drones are given to the Russian forces. We've seen some evidence of that. CNN recently posted a video of one of their correspondents actually interviewing the Ukrainian volunteers who use their commercial drones to spotlight Russian forces. And the volunteer actually said that early on, when they launched their DJI drone, shortly after there was a mortar attack or artillery strike on their position, which was more or less accurate. Nobody died, but the shells landed very closely. And so their position was identified very quickly. And so that could be one of 2 reasons. Reason number one is DJI actually gave Russian forces the ability to pinpoint DJI drones used by the Ukrainians, or Russian electronic warfare was actually successful in that specific pocket, because that's how AEW actually works. It identifies, tracks, and sometimes jams communication between the drone and the operator. And so, yes, the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian volunteers claim that DJI drones may not be as effective as before, and they may move away from using just DJI platforms to using other commercial and other platforms as well, including American-supplied Switchblade and other loitering munitions, which can also be used as ISR platforms.
This is consequential though, because while it's what you said, the second option that Russian EW was able to pinpoint the location of the operator.
Probably that's one of the reasons why that happened. That's again, and that's how it's supposed to work. This is what we expected going into this conflict. That is, objectively speaking, because this is how the Russian military talked about their EW and counter UAV capabilities, that they would be able to identify drone operators and strike their positions. This is what they practiced in Syria, and this is what they've seen happen in the Nagorno-Karabakh and other conflicts as well.
It's interesting also because, well, again, the outcome is the same, but it's quite different. There's a big difference between DGI, ergo, Chinese government. It's a oversimplification, but there is a link there. Being able to immediately transmit the information, because I would imagine that's also a complicated process between this going to DGI servers and then the information being fed back to the Russian reconnaissance strike complex, and between Russians triangulating the position. It's quite the effect is the same, but it's a very different qualitatively, I guess, situation. But another one I have, if you don't mind, is the question: how is the concept of air superiority affected by the drones? Because again, supposedly Russians, again, we've seen Su-27s flying sorties a couple of days back over the Snake Island, but supposedly Russians wiped out most of Ukrainian Air Force. But the drones are still up, they are still online, and while they're unable to interdict enemy planes, this component of air superiority, where we have information dominance, is sort of altered. It's not longer there, right?
Well, I think we have to define what we mean by air superiority in this conflict. If in this conflict air superiority means one side, like the Russians, having complete dominance in the air at all points of the front over Ukrainian forces, then we're talking about one type of air superiority, which was not achieved in this war. If we're talking air superiority as the ability of either side to actually maintain aerial assets for intelligence gathering or even strikes missions, right? Then we probably have to conclude that this type of air superiority is impossible to achieve, because each side can launch hundreds of different types of drones. And these drones can provide data on the adversaries as well as conduct their own strikes. And we're seeing in Ukraine how difficult it is to actually achieve that type of superiority, because if each side can use a small DJI drone just to sort of to conduct their own surveillance, how do you counter that, right? There was an expectation that the Russian military would equip most units with EW systems, small portable systems, including counter UAV EW rifles, which work at close ranges. There were reports that the Russian military was training a lot of their units to counter small unmanned aerial systems with small arms fire, with machine guns. In other words, anything short of an RPG, right? But again, in kind of a conflict like Ukraine, where the front is so large, where so many units and forces are involved, how do you achieve air superiority in this type of a war? You can't apply blanket electronic warfare, right? You can't just shut down every single system that emits an electronic signal. That's not possible. So you have to do it in a very pinpointed fashion. You have to prioritize which segments of the front actually get advanced EW or air defense protection or advanced aerial coverage, and which sectors probably will not, because of the moving nature, changing nature of the front hour by the hour. And so we've seen this play out on a smaller scale in Libya, for example, in Syria and Nagorno-Karabakh, where more advanced air defense systems are actually able to counter Bayraktars. They were able to clear the air of aircraft and other aerial assets, but again, in a very pinpointed fashion. Ukraine, as I mentioned before, is a large conflict. The Ukrainian front is very large, and there are so many units fighting, so many units trying to maneuver, so many units essentially fighting right now, that it's not possible to have a full air superiority over all of the Ukrainian territory. And the Russians learned that lesson in the first several weeks of the war. They're learning it now as they're trying to achieve air superiority, and yet the Bayraktars are still flying, the UAVs are still flying, and the Russian forces are still getting hit.
Samuel, You already mentioned just recently about Nagorno-Karabakh. I remember already at this moment, some experts, military experts, started to say that tank as a military tool, let's say like that, it's like a disappearing, it's dying creature. But recently I was reading one Russian expert, and he said, our use of tanks in this war, it's showing that tank is still should be part of warfare. Would you agree? I mean, like we have two, let's say, teams. One is supporting that tank is member of the war. Another is like we need to concentrate mostly on drones or some other technical advantages. What do you think?
Well, I think each conflict where tanks are used at scale, where there's a lot of warfare, where we have urban warfare, where we observe other types of warfare where tanks are involved, obviously places a tank in danger, right? The whole point of a tank is to fight, is to be there at the front, taking punishment and delivering punishment. It is a tactical weapon. It is not necessarily a strategic weapon. And so tank is a tactical weapon that fights at close ranges or relatively close ranges, right? It is going to suffer attrition. It's going to suffer casualties. And tanks also in modern warfare aren't supposed to fight on their own. They're supposed to fight with, together with infantry, together with air defense, especially in a combined arms operation. And when that happens, when the tank is an organic part of a much larger, more diverse set of military weapons and systems, including infantry, it could actually be very successful. When the tank is out there by itself, when it's not protected, as we've seen in Ukraine, as we've seen in Nagorno-Karabakh, then it can suffer significant losses. And so Nagorno-Karabakh was a very special case because Nagorno-Karabakh forces were fighting static warfare. They were essentially dug in. And they assumed that their previous war fought against Azerbaijan between 92 and 94 would actually be sort of the harbinger of things to come. And this type of positional warfare would be successful because they commanded the heights, they commanded the mountains against the invading Azeri force. They did not adequately prepare these static positions against observation by and strikes by the UAVs like Bayraktars and the loitering munitions. And so in Ukraine, we've obviously seen a lot of tanks lost by both sides. Because of the social media content, we're seeing a lot of Russian tanks lost. Some Russian tanks are lost to a specific design, the older T-72 tanks, where a design prioritized the lower profile and relatively lightweight for the type of warfare against NATO that never actually came. And so these tanks are still fighting with that sort of one design flaw, the exploding turret. It doesn't happen every time the T-72 is struck. It doesn't happen every time to each tank, but that problem is still there. But as the Americans claim, the tank is the king of the kill chain. That no other vehicle today can substitute a tank in combat. And if tanks are used wisely, if they're used with infantry, if they're used with other forces in a combined operation, there is still no substitute for that military technology. And of course, advanced militaries like the United States, like Russia, like China, like Israel, like other countries like Turkey and Iran and many others, actually working on robotic versions of these tanks. And there's certainly a lot of developments taking place in the UK, in Europe, and in other countries. Why? Because if you can essentially take the crew out, but keep everything else in, that is great about the tank. Its protection, its defenses, its ability to fire 125 to 150 millimeter shells. But take the crew out, then you are essentially preserving the crux of the tank, right? You are preserving the best capabilities without endangering the crew in any shape or form. So that's kind of the next evolution of warfare, right? All advanced militaries are talking about the introduction of robotic systems and complexes into the war. Conflicts across the Middle East and Ukraine are proving that there's still no substitute for a human operator, a human soldier. a human crew in many of these systems. But assuming certain other technologies mature along, along the way that the military thinking evolves, then at some point in the future, many militaries think they can field robotic systems on their own, robotic tanks, or robotic tanks together with manned tanks in a combined sort of operation. And so again, despite the tank losses, there's no substitute for that vehicle. No armored car, no armored vehicle today that's not a tank can really substitute a tank. If the tank is used smartly, if it's used wisely, and if caution and care is exercised in trying to protect these tanks from ground attacks as well as aerial attacks.
It's very interesting also because, if and when the unmanned tank concept is going to become, widely used, it will also allow the tank to escape this offense-defense, fight, that, I don't know, up-armoring.
Well, the whole point of fielding robotics, as the Russians claim, and obviously they're not the first to say it, but it's a simple logical conclusion of fielding robotic systems, is to take the humans out of conflict, right? And by definition, such robotic systems then essentially they become cheap, they become expendable, because that's the whole point of using robotic systems instead of a manned system, right?
And in that way, way, the tank can avoid the fate of dreadnoughts, right? You won't have to up-armor them, make them heavier and heavier.
Right. And so if you can send waves of robotic systems, different types of robotic systems into combat, including urban combat, and they're lost, well, so be it, because that's why you're designing them in the first place. And then you can send other waves of robotic systems, and maybe then they can send actual soldiers to finish off the adversary, to flush out the adversary. Then you conduct aerial strikes on areas identified by these robotic systems. This is the concept that the Russians are talking about for years in their military journals, in their military academias. This is the concept that is described in the United States, and again, within the military academies and within the thought processes of most militaries, which are designing and building robotics and unmanned systems to eventually, at some point in the future, to augment or maybe partially or fully replace manned formations in the air, in the ground, or at sea.
So if as we're slowly headed towards a conclusion, I still wanted to ask you a couple strategic questions, because you said something very interesting, that the Russian thinkers, the thought, the academia, whatever you name it, they had very advanced thought and very sophisticated thought. They're rather impressive. And they said, well, it's two different things. The apparent, what they said about them modern, like creating their drone industry and being right about this. So that's one thing. It could have been fake, or overblown, but the quality of thought was clearly there in the Russian elite. So what the hell went wrong? And why did
nothing went wrong, because military thought and discussions of military capabilities, especially future military capabilities, is just that. It's a discussion. Because you're talking about technologies and concepts that don't necessarily exist today, that may exist at some point in the future. And that's certainly true for the Russians, because they were basically in lockstep with the prevailing thought for advanced military warfare that involves emerging technologies like robotics, AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, because that's what's discussed in the United States, in China. That's what's discussed in European Union, in the UK, in Israel, in Turkey, in Iran, in South Korea, and other nations, Estonia, other nations that are developing these systems and are thinking through how those systems will impact current and future combat. But there's a difference between the theoretical thought and the actual practical war, because war basically equalizes, or it makes all capabilities equal more or less, simply because ground warfare hasn't really changed much in several decades since the end of the Cold War, since even since World War II. We're seeing basically similar type of warfare happening now that took place in World War II, plus a UAV as an extra pair extra pair of eyes, which doesn't always help and which doesn't always make mission effective. And so the actual conduct of war brings down, not brings down, I think a better way to say it, the actual conduct of war is basically putting infantry mechanized infantry, air forces against other infantries and against other mechanized forces. And those tactics aren't really that different. We do have advanced communications equipment. We do have advanced electronic warfare. We do have advanced sensors. And that advanced military technology enables one side to be more successful, maybe one side to be faster in identifying and targeting the adversary. But once these opposing forces close in, right, then the warfare isn't really that advanced, unfortunately. And so the gap between Russian military thought about future warfare is really wide when it comes to the military that exists today. And the military that exists today is very much still dependent on legacy systems, on modernized legacy systems, and on relatively older concepts which have been modernized somewhat based on different types of conflicts. But even that type of modernization isn't necessarily applicable in all environments, because some conflicts where Russia fought recently, those conflicts had a very permissive environment when compared to the environment like Ukraine or any type of future environment. So again, it's not that something went wrong. It's that maybe the Russian military academia was looking a little bit too far into the future. It's not anywhere close to fielding the numbers of, for example, unmanned ground vehicles or unmanned maritime systems that it needs to match the current technological reality with the concepts exercised and developed by the military academia. And that's not that different from what is happening in the West, for example, right? There's a lot of experimentation taking place right now in the United States, but we don't have the mass scale introduction of robotic systems into the US military yet, because a lot has to happen policy-wise, concept-wise, tactics-wise, and testing-wise for these technologies to become familiar to the forces and to become the organic part of military formations.
But can this war change this situation?
Can this war what?
Change this situation?
In part. We're certainly going to see, I think, greater use of smaller UAVs by all forces at the tactical edge. We're going to see greater introduction of loitering munitions at scale, at the very tactical level as well, something that has been in discussion since the Nagorno-Karabakh War. We're going to see greater introduction of unmanned combat aerial vehicles as well, but we're not necessarily going to see too many changes to introduction of unmanned systems in ground warfare yet, because the technology isn't necessarily there. We have concepts, we have models, we have testing in more or less permissive environments, but introducing these systems in an actual combat is a very different situation, and they don't always work. And so I think when it comes to certain technologies like UAVs, there's going to be a change and a greater acquisition. For other types of forces, I think for other types of units within the militaries that are looking at the Ukrainian conflict, obviously there will be a lot of discussion on the role of special forces, logistics, maneuver warfare, and other types of warfare observed today.
Yeah. It's super interesting what you said about the Russian military thought being too far ahead and diving into, good concepts, terrific concepts, but being detached from the reality on the ground. So,
some of their thinking, right? I mean, some of their thinking is too far ahead, right? And in other words, their discussions about the use of robotics and unmanned systems and AI in the military is really kind of, for the future, because the current conduct of war depends on the military force as it is today, how it's prepared, how it's motivated, how it's supplied, what are the logistics, right?
So if you're reforming armed forces, I'm sorry for interrupting. If you're reforming armed forces and you gotta change direction because you're fielding a force like Russian did based on old assumptions, how do you avoid this trap? How do you mix the immediate needs with the overall strategic direction?
Well, this is something that's going to be right. This is something that's going to be discussed for years and will be the subject of many debates, many reports, many deliberations, both open and classified. How do you prepare the force for the fight where you can no longer hide your forces, right? When you can no longer mask your forces, when everything that you do can be on social media, where commercial UAVs could be just as present in the air at any given point as the military UAVs, right? How do you prepare your military force for this type of exposure and the attrition and losses that come with this type of exposure, right? U.S. military, for example, for the first several decades after the end of the Cold War, as they said themselves, never had to look up, meaning they never had to deal with the aerial threat, because U.S. military was able to dominate the aerial environment. They were able to dominate the air in conflicts where they fought. Well, in Syria, for the first time, right, the American military had to look up because they were subject to the same types of commercial drone attacks as other militaries in that region. And now in Ukraine, both the Russians and the Ukrainians have to look up and be sort of aware of a persistent threat, not just from the commercial drones that conduct surveillance, but now also from loitering munitions like Switchblade, like Kub, which also have a persistent presence, can stay in the air for quite a while and strike the target once they see it. So that changes the way the ground forces operate, and that changes the way the combined forces operate as well.
All right, Sam, personally, I have like 10 more questions, but I know we had a deal about the time, the attention span, of our listeners. So
right.
I think on this note, it is time to end at least this conversation. I really do hope we can run it again and go on.
I do hope so too. This has been very interesting, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. It was great. So thank you very much, everybody. Our guest today was Sam Bendett. With me was Ridvan, Bari, Urcosta. Have a great day and hope to see you soon.